So welcome everyone. My name is Brene Lloyd and I'm with Northwatch, and this evening you're joining a webinar co-hosted by Northwatch and Nuclear Waste Watch. We have our panel participants this evening are all part of Nuclear Waste Watch along with others. Nuclear Waste Watch is an alliance of environmental and community and safe energy, other public interest organizations concerned about radioactive waste in Canada, as is, and Northwatch is part of that network as well. And we've done a lot of work with many of you over the last few years on radioactive waste policy in Canada. And this evening, we're looking at where did it go? Where did we, what did we achieve? Where did that radioactive waste policy review take us? So thank you very much for joining us. We've got a fairly packed agenda. We're going to begin with presentations from Teresa, Ole, and Susan, and then we'll go to Q&A, and then we'll wrap up. So if you would like in the chat, and maybe our speakers will do this as they begin, to introduce yourself and where you're joining from. My name is Brene Lloyd. I'm with Northwatch. We're a regional coalition in northeastern Ontario. So our membership is in the territories of Robinson-Huron, Robinson-Superior, Anishinaabe-Aski Nation territory, and the unceded Algonquin territories in the Ottawa, Montreal, Temiskaming watershed. And I'm joining on behalf of Northwatch this evening. So we're going to move now to our presentations, and our first presenter this evening is Teresa McClenahan from the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and Teresa's going to walk us through a recap of Canada's radioactive waste policy review and those outcomes. So thank you, Teresa. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Teresa, for starting our evening.
Yes, thank you, Brene. Happy to do it. Welcome, everyone. And some of these slides, some of you may have seen before, but I have some additional analysis. I'm joining you from Paris in Southwest Ontario in the Grand River Valley, which is currently home to my friends and colleagues from the Six Nations of the Grand River and Mississaugas of the Credit. And I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Environmental Law Association and also a Senior Counsel there. Next slide. So, especially for those of you who joined us on the journey, the multi-year journey, a peer review of the IAEA had called Canada out for its lack of an up-to-date radioactive waste policy. So a consultation was commenced, and in the course of that, we collectively, many of you, ourselves, put together an alternative policy, which we put forward, which would have more constructive provisions. And we continued to provide commentary over the ensuing, basically 3 years while that consultation continued. And I've kept those links in this slide for you. Next slide. And the high level of the things we were calling for were independence of the oversight of radioactive waste management and decommissioning, independent from government and industry. Also, not to abandon radioactive waste, rather to provide for perpetual care and monitoring, the essential requirement for openness and transparency in its management, with the right of Indigenous peoples and other Canadians to access information, engage in the relevant decision-making, and to know the risks, fully informed. Not to import radioactive waste from other countries, and not to extract plutonium from used fuel waste for reprocessing or pyroprocessing. Next slide. So when the policy was finally issued, which it was, and there'll be a link in a couple of slides, and it's been approved by the Government of Canada, there's a preamble, and so I have reviewed that from the point of view of what's been driving the decisions that the government made when it finalized the policy and when it really disregarded the input from ourselves and many of you in many important respects. And so this is some of the text from the preamble of the policy. It says that Canada is a world leader in nuclear technologies, and you can really see the influence of the industrial lobby who benefit from the sector on Ottawa decision makers. It says in that preamble that Canada has the world's richest deposits of uranium in northern Saskatchewan. And that use of the term rich implies that that's an advantage in some way and that there's a necessity, an economic or social or other necessity to exploit it. It also states in the preamble that we have one of the lowest emitting energy mixes worldwide. And by doing so, it implies that nuclear is essential to Canada's overall energy mix and to its low emission properties, but it's only 15% of Canada's electricity supply at present, and a much lower percentage if you look at the overall energy mix. It also states that nuclear is recognized internationally as playing an important role in meeting climate targets and achieving a net zero emissions economy by 2050. And time doesn't permit me to get into this statement, but it is a highly debatable claim at the very least. And it also says, as a non-emitting source of energy generation, nuclear energy produces electricity with almost no harmful emissions of greenhouse gases, but this ignores routine radioactive emissions, ignores accident risk. It implies greenhouse gases are the only type of pollution to worry about, and is likely incorrect anyway about whether it really is a low source in terms of greenhouse gases when you take into account the whole fuel chain. Next slide. It also says that radioisotopes are used for life-saving cancer treatments. And again, it implies that major commercial nuclear power is necessary for this, which is not correct. And it's a play on emotions. And you see this every time nuclear is described to the general public. This is one of the favorite lines that the industry and government put forward. It says that nuclear power allows for groundbreaking research by Canadian scientists. So this implies that anyone with concerns is somehow anti-science or anti-progress, which is completely false, of course. It talks about the historical importance in Canada in that preamble without admitting the parallel Canadian role in atomic weapons research that started nuclear industry in Canada, and without acknowledging the massive impacts on communities from the legacy of mining, refining, processing uranium for nuclear power. And again, states it continues to be an important part of Canada's energy and economy mix, but in fact, as I said, it's only 15%. Next slide. So there's also an articulation of the vision and the scope in the policy, and each section is longer than what I've addressed here. But for example, looking at those with a critical eye, in the vision, it states that all radioactive waste in Canada is currently safely managed in compliance with Canadian legislation in accordance with international standards, and that facilities licensed by Canada's nuclear regulator. And as I said, that's just breathtakingly erroneous. And many people who have been dealing with the legacy of nuclear waste, for example, in their communities would recognize that. It also, in the scope section, talks about the policy applying to radioactive waste from past practices, historic, current, and future, and to decommissioning, and applies to radioactive waste generated unintentionally, such as from emergencies or unintended releases. But this and the commitments in the rest of the policy lack specificity and evidence of a pathway to ensure that all of these types of hazards will, in fact, be well managed. The next slide. So when we looked at the policy as a whole, when it was originally issued, we reviewed it and compared it to those public expectations that I mentioned earlier. The results were highly disappointing, not providing for independent management, providing for the potential to continue with projects that would abandon nuclear waste, a nod to transparency, but nothing about how that would be improved because we have very significant concerns at present, and not only failing to preclude imports, but admitting they are occurring and will continue according to the policy at least. Next slide. There's no prohibition on reprocessing nuclear waste, and it not only failed to ban reprocessing, but was very disingenuous, stating that there is no reprocessing, quote, the purpose of which would be to extract fissile material, and therefore the ban is outside the policy. You'll hear more about that later tonight. And of course, this completely missed the mark about what our concern was and ignored the clear message from nuclear non-proliferation experts about the risk that Canada has been creating. Again, more to follow in a bit. Next slide. So I have some recommendations because the policy says that it will be reviewed every 10 years. We'll obviously continue to work and have more recommendations, but right off the bat, we should keep in mind that preferably sooner, but certainly by the time of any review, we would really want to delete quite a bit of that preamble, which is not factual and is at the very least highly contested opinion stating. We would want to see the clear acceptance of ultimate responsibility for safe management of radioactive waste by the federal government, not unsubstantiated, unspecific statements. We'd want to delete the fourth overall principle that they put in the policy, which was about, quote, global excellence in the fields of radioactive waste management and decommissioning, because when you look at all the specific implementation of that policy, it mostly has to do with allowing the Canadian officials to go to international venues and talk about what they're doing in Canada and is not actually advancing the policy. And we'd want to amend terms like the federal government ensures and recognizes and such, and replace them with specific, clear federal commitments because they have managed to avoid any specific commitments in the policy. We would want, of course, incorporation of the key principles we talked about earlier, as well as a clear ban on reprocessing. And that might be it. Next slide. So that's it from me for now, and I'll watch for questions at the end. Over to you, Brene.
Great. Thanks very much, Teresa. And over to you, Ol.
Well, thank you, Brene. I'll let you move on to the next slide for me, please. I think all of us who participated in the policy exercise had a legitimate expectation that we would be able to participate in the RAD waste strategy exercise as well. Nuclear Waste Watch certainly conveyed that expectation clearly to Minister of Natural Resources, Jonathan Wilkinson. So we were a bit taken aback in October of last year when the Minister Wilkinson simply endorsed a strategy that had been put together by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, which is an industry-run organization. And we were not particularly pleased with his statement that minimizing basically radioactive waste considerations, saying, oh, well, it's much more important for us to deal with climate change, and radioactive waste is not that great a consideration. And I think that shows in a very poor quality NWMO strategy, Nuclear Waste Management Organization. Next slide, please. So what is in this NWMO strategy? It says that basically most of the waste problem is already solved. There are existing plans for all of Canada's high-level fuel waste, which is, of course, the NWMO's DGR proposals. There's existing plans for uranium mine and mill waste, all of it, for 2 federal reactors that have intermediate level waste, and for all federal low-level waste. And so there were only 2 gaps, according to the NWMO, non-federal low-level waste, and most of the intermediate level waste, along with a small amount of non-fuel high-level waste. So one of the NWMO had 2 key recommendations, quote unquote, to address these gaps. And one was to put non-federal low-level waste in multiple near-surface disposal facilities, or NSDFs for short. And the NWMO strategy discusses several models for these NSDFs, but it says the preferred model is a engineered containment mound, which is the type of NSDF that was recently approved by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission for Chalk River and is currently the subject of 2 court challenges. And the other key NWMO recommendation is, quote, disposal of intermediate level and non-fuel high level waste in a deep geological repository, that is a DGR. Now, this would not be the same DGR as the one they're working on for high level waste, but the NWMO says it would take responsibility for this new DGR, but also notes that nobody currently has that responsibility. Next slide, please. The NWMO held a series, or maybe at least one technical workshop, where unnamed participants said that they preferred the engineered containment mound, the NSDF model for low-level waste. And as I mentioned, this is the model of the Chalk River NSDF, which was proposed by a multinational consortium that operates federal nuclear sites under a 10-year contract that expires next year. And that consortium of Fluor, Jacobs, which are 2 Texas companies, and what used to be SNC-Lavalin, owns Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, CNL. So it seems this model is now proposed by the NWMO as the solution for all Canada's low-level waste and has been endorsed by Minister Wilkinson. And just to mention our NSDF court challenge, says that much of the waste destined for the Chalk River facility is actually intermediate level waste, and it cannot be left above ground according to safety standards of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and nor would the NSDF conform to Canadian regulations for disposal of nuclear substances. So that's part of our court challenge. Okay, and if you look at on this slide, the NWMO says that rolling stewardship, which it sort of gave a nod to, is not a disposable option, whatever that means. And the NSDF seems to have difficulty with English to French translation as well. It doesn't like using the French terms in the CNSC glossary for disposal, which are élimination and évacuation. Instead, the NWMO uses stockage or storage throughout the French version of the strategy, which I think creates some confusion about exactly what is the strategy. Is it a storage strategy? Is it a disposal strategy? Anyway, thought I'd mention that. Next slide, please, Bernane. And in terms of the second key gap, the intermediate level waste gap, somehow all the technical workshop participants failed to note that the NWMO had omitted one of the IAEA's, its preferred option for ILW of emplacing it in a, quote, I'll quote, facility constructed in caverns, vaults, or silos at least a few tens of meters below ground level and up to a few hundred meters below ground level, unquote. So somehow that sort of intermediate depth underground facility for intermediate level waste never made it onto the technical workshop list of options, even though that has been used for many years in other countries like Finland and Sweden. Next slide, please. Just to note that the NWMO strategy does not specifically address reactor decommissioning, whereas the policy that that Teresa just discussed was a policy on waste and decommissioning. The strategy only deals with waste, but the strategy does endorse the plan of CNL, that privately owned company, to leave in place 2 shut down CANDU prototype reactors that were built by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited and are owned still by the federal government. These reactors would be converted into permanent intermediate level waste disposal facilities by filling them with concrete and grout and then abandoning them next to the Winnipeg and Ottawa rivers. So abandonment is definitely part of the NWMO strategy. So this is a so-called in situ decommissioning strategy, and it's also been endorsed by the CNSC. It's been endorsed by the Canadian Standards Association, but the International Atomic Energy Agency says that is unacceptable except in cases of real emergencies like a major reactor accident. Next slide, please. So I guess I don't know when we're ever going to get a chance to really weigh in on this strategy, but it's pretty seriously flawed, and I don't think we're doing any favors to our future generations. Thanks, Brene.
Great, thank you very much, all. And we're going to move on from one sobering presentation to another and to our third. So I'm going to turn over to Susan, who I think is going to share slides from her own computer for the discussion on reprocessing. Susan?
Thanks, Brene, and hi, everyone. Here we go. So what I'm showing here is a Google Earth map of the Point Lepreau nuclear station in the Bay of Fundy in New Brunswick. And I'm going to be speaking about reprocessing radioactive fuel waste in Canada. I'm here today representing the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick, and I'm also an adjunct prof at St. Thomas University in Fredericton. And I mention that because I'm going to be talking in here about some of the research that I'm doing on this topic. Okay, just a second here. Okay, so plutonium is a byproduct of nuclear fission. It's made in a nuclear reactor, and plutonium stays in the used fuel rods after it's removed from a reactor. This is a picture of concrete silos filled with used nuclear fuel rods at the Point Lepreau site in New Brunswick. When they're removed, an irradiated fuel bundle, when it's removed fresh out of a nuclear reactor, it's so deadly that it will kill any human without shielding in less than a minute, standing a meter away, simply because it is so radioactive. It's highly radioactive when it comes out of a reactor. And it's that radiation, the danger, that prohibits direct access to the plutonium because nobody can get near it. It's just too dangerous. However, the plutonium can be removed, and that's what reprocessing is. It's when you remove the plutonium and some other products from the used nuclear fuel. And once it's extracted, plutonium could be used to make new fuel, and it could also be used to make an explosive, such as a nuclear weapon. This is a photograph. That's not plutonium, that's a ball of glass, the exact size of the plutonium ball in the Nagasaki bomb. Reprocessing is currently not permitted commercially in Canada. It is being done at Chalk River, the nuclear lab, but it's never happened commercially in Canada. And in fact, since the 1970s, there's been a de facto ban following a test nuclear explosion that India conducted in 1974 when they extracted plutonium from a so-called peaceful reactor, which was a gift from Canada. So why are we talking about this now if it's not allowed in Canada? Well, because it's being proposed. So I'm going to go over a few timelines here. This first one is for what's the project known as the Moltex project. So in 2018, the government of New Brunswick announced a $5 million grant to the Moltex Energy, which is a small startup company in the UK. In June 2018, Moltex opened an office in St. John, New Brunswick. And in July, Moltex announced that it wanted to develop its reprocessing technology at Point Lepreau. And this is a photo of the Point Lepreau nuclear plant on the Bay of Fundy. Moltex and the government call reprocessing recycling, which is just a greenwashing term to make the technology seem good and harmless. So this is what Moltex is planning to do at Point Lepreau. This is a Google map, high-level view of the Point Lepreau nuclear generating station. And about 1 kilometer away here, you have another compound, which is the concrete silos that you saw in the earlier photograph that hold the used, highly radioactive used fuel rods. And what Moltex is proposing to do is to open the silos, remove the solid bundles of irradiated nuclear waste, basically melt them down in a process and extract the plutonium and create new fuel, which it proposes to use in its proposed small reactor. The key point here is less than 1% of the used CANDU fuel could be used to make new fuel, and 99% would be left over as new forms of radioactive waste, primarily liquid. So back to the timeline, what happened then, so at first it was only the New Brunswick government that gave the company funding, and then in March 2021, the federal government gave 50.5 million to Moltex. And then a year later, the New Brunswick government gave another 5 million to Moltex. And all of this, it sounds like a lot of money, but it was just meant to be seed money to attract private investment. There have been no major investors or customers that have appeared for the Moltex product. And then a year ago, Moltex asked for $250 million, but it will need more than $2 billion to develop and build its project. So we don't know what's going to happen there, if they're going to get the money, where that money is going to come from. $2 billion obviously is a huge amount of money, especially for a small province like New Brunswick. Okay, so the timeline on the policy development, as Teresa mentioned, January to March 2022, there were public consultations on the new radioactive waste policy, and those overwhelmingly rejected reprocessing. And then a year ago, Nuclear Waste Watch coordinated a national ban reprocessing campaign by civil society groups, and I think many of the people on this call would have participated in those. There were webinars and videos and different bulletins that went out during that period. And then just when that was finished, there was the final federal policy appeared in March 2023. And as Teresa mentioned at the start, the new policy sidesteps the reprocessing issue and it fails to ban it. Okay, I'm just going to talk a bit about the publicity for reasons that will become obvious in a minute. So how did Canadians first hear about this? Well, there has not been much publicity at all, but in July 2020, there was the first of a series of critical articles about reprocessing that appeared in the Hill Times. The first article I wrote with Gordon Edwards. We've since written a few. MV Ramana has also published in the Hill Times. I think Ole has an article that mentions reprocessing in the Hill Times. But aside from the Hill Times, there hasn't been much at all written about this. In May 2021, which was a couple of months after the federal government gave that 50.5 million to Moltex, a group of 9 distinguished US non-proliferation experts wrote an open letter to Prime Minister Trudeau expressing their concerns about the Moltex project. And this is a quote from the letter. By backing spent fuel reprocessing and plutonium extraction, the Government of Canada will undermine the global nuclear weapons non-proliferation regime that Canada has done so much to strengthen. And these experts called for an international review of nuclear weapons proliferation implications of the Moltex project. So shortly after that letter was published, within a week actually, the first news article appeared in the Globe and Mail raising concerns about reprocessing. That was written by the journalist Matthew McLaren, and he wrote 2 more articles in the Globe and Mail in 2022 and 2023. I've done an analysis of news articles about reprocessing across Canada. And aside from those 3 articles, there's been almost no critical news coverage in corporate media about the reprocessing plans. So obviously, this is a Pokalogan on the Bay of Fundy, and actually in the distance here, I don't think you can see it, there's a little lump here on the horizon that would be the Point Lepreau nuclear plant. It is crucial for government information about reprocessing to be transparent and accurate. And Teresa mentioned our overall concerns about nuclear waste policy and the lack of transparency about nuclear issues in Canada. People need accurate information to form opinions on whether or not reprocessing should be permitted in Canada in future. I have done an analysis of government information online, And what I found was that the government info available to the public just repeats the recycling term numerous times. So continued greenwashing. Two government reports mention reprocessing without explaining what it is. And you will not find any mention of plutonium or nuclear weapons proliferation risks related to reprocessing in any government information. I filed federal access to information requests to find out information and communications behind the scenes to see what was going on, basically, because you couldn't get the information available to the public online, as I mentioned. In December 2022, filed ATI requests to 8 federal departments and agencies. And in those requests, I asked for communication since 2016 related to reprocessing or recycling used nuclear fuel. Since then, I've received 5 responses, and I'm still chasing up the 3 requests outstanding after 14 months. So in the responses that I got, I looked at how the government and federal agencies described reprocessing and the extent to which they're working with the nuclear industry on this file. Most of the responses that I received were heavily redacted. What I got back was many emails about reprocessing. I could see that reprocessing was on the agenda of numerous meetings. And one of the first interesting things is, like, unlike the public information that the government is putting out, their internal government communications use the correct term reprocessing and not recycling. At least several departments and agencies are aware of the weapons proliferation risks of reprocessing, but the main concern expressed in these discussions and communications about reprocessing is how to support industry development. The Globe and Mail articles that I mentioned earlier prompted a flurry of internal emails and media lines about nuclear safeguards. And the open letter to the Prime Minister from the US non-proliferation experts was widely circulated and referenced. And even Moltex ended up publishing a response to that American letter on their website, but the draft response was circulated and reviewed by public servants before it was actually posted on the industry website. There were many meetings between the federal government and industry with reprocessing on the agenda. And significantly, there were meetings between government officials and the CANDU Owners Group to discuss a draft reprocessing guidelines that the CANDU Owners Group has developed. So one of the questions I have is Natural Resources Canada, NRCan, which is the agency responsible for the nuclear industry in Canada, is that department fully informing other federal departments about the Moltex project and the reprocessing concerns? The NRCan team coordinating the reprocessing file was led by a former lobbyist for SNC-Lavalin. He's now left the government and he's back in the private sector, but at the time that all this was going on, he was leading that team. It's clear that the government and the nuclear industry are tightly entwined. The industry clearly wants reprocessing, but at the same time, public servants are sensitive to public perception. So there is clearly, my research has shown that there's a deficit of news and government information on the proposed plutonium extraction project. And what that means is that Canadians are uninformed about the basic facts of reprocessing. The lack of facts out there leaves us vulnerable to misinformation, and the government itself is propagating this misinformation. In part, as I mentioned, they're misinforming the public by only using the greenwashing term recycling. And at the same time, they're aware of the implications and concerns related to reprocessing, but they're not sharing that information with the public. The lack of sharing is the opposite of transparency, and the lack of informed public debate about reprocessing weakens democracy. So what we can see, particularly from the access to information requests, is that decision-making about reprocessing and reprocessing policy is happening behind the scenes, and the industry has ready access to policymakers behind the scenes, and the public, us, is excluded from the real circuit of power. The public engagement on nuclear policy is through these public consultations that Teresa mentioned. But these consultations are performative only. They're really just for show. They're predetermined outcomes that are favorable to the nuclear industry. But at the same time, as I mentioned, public servants are sensitive about their public image because the critical media articles about reprocessing were flagged and widely discussed. And so public concerns expressed through the media do have an impact. And so I'm on my last few slides with the question, can the public influence reprocessing policy? And just start here with a quote from Leonard Cohen, there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. Nuclear Waste Watch organized a meeting with government policymakers in November 2023, and the purpose was to share perspectives on reprocessing and reprocessing policy. So the meeting did happen a few months ago. There were 7 representatives from civil society and NGO organizations, including the 4 of us on the panel today. We represented our various organizations along with 3 other colleagues from civil society. There were 4 representatives from academia and 5 from federal government departments and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And that opened a new channel of communication on reprocessing policy. So what are the next steps? Well, we're still waiting for the ATI responses from December 2022. I'm planning to file new ATI requests on reprocessing soon. And we really do need to make sure that there's ongoing media on reprocessing that will prompt discussion by policymakers. But at the moment, there's no new policy being proposed on reprocessing, and things seem to have just quieted right down on the reprocessing policy file. So we don't really know what's happening, but we want to keep those new lines of communication open. So that's it for me. Thanks, Brene.
Great. Thank you very much, Susan. That was excellent. I'm seeing that I'm not in the share mode that I want to be in. There we are. So Susan raised a question, what's next? We're about to go to question and answer, but what's next? We've spent invested a lot of time and effort into the policy review process. We've heard from Teresa, Ole, Susan, the outcomes of that process, but we're at the same time confronted with a large number of nuclear projects. There's a very intense and comprehensive agenda being played out by the nuclear industry right now in Canada. So there's the near surface disposal facility in Chalk River, in situ decommissioning of reactors at White Shell and at Rolphton on the Winnipeg and the Ottawa rivers. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization site selection for a deep geological repository. They're saying they'll select a site in 2024. The NWMO has also indicated that they are within the next 12 to 18 months going to begin a siting process for deep geological repository or repositories for intermediate level waste. As Susan has outlined, there's uncertain status of reprocessing radioactive waste fuel in Canada, potential new waste sources, and intense promotion of both small and large new reactors in Canada. And then there's continued policy and program development by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, largely led by industry. And just as a detail on that, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission has for several months now, since October, been without a president. They have an acting president, but without a president. And for some part of that period have also been with only an acting registrar. And I think that we should all consider what that means, that the federal government invests as much time and energy as they do in the promotion of nuclear power and the smoothing the way for nuclear waste initiatives, and yet does not seem to have the capacity to appoint a president of Canada's nuclear regulator. So all that's to say, lots on the go. I'm going to open the questions. We have all our panelists here available for questions. I'm going to ask you again to limit your questions to questions, not comments. Keep them short. Keep your questions respectful and on topic, and use the upvote to get, give us some indication of what questions are, the highest priority for all of the participants. So we've got 5 questions in the queue, and I'm going to just start and work our way through them. So the first question is from Dennis. He attended a online session, a webinar with Canadian Nuclear Laboratories a few weeks ago. There were 2, one about the in situ reactor decommissioning at Whiteshell, and one about the nuclear power demonstration project, which is the reactor at Ralston on the Ottawa River. And he submitted a question about the dismantling plan for Whiteshell, references a report and the IEA policy that forbids in situ disposal. And he was told that his question was deemed too technical to answer, and he was told he would receive a written reply by email that today does not come. Why will not dismantling of old reactors be implemented when published report shows it is feasible? Why are my questions buried and ignored and deemed too technical to answer? Well, with regret, I have to say, Dennis, those are actually questions for Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, but I will say I was on those sessions as well, and I had the same experience of questions not being answered or being answered. Some not answered, some not acknowledged, some answered in part. I'm going to pass it to Ol to answer this question. Ol, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Dennis. Yeah, since I mentioned in situ decommissioning in my presentation, I thought I'd just say that the motivation is that it's just a quick and cheap way of trying to deal with a problem that in an inappropriate way, frankly, creating a permanent intermediate level waste disposal site right at the surface next to 2 major Canadian rivers, the WR1 Whiteshell 1 reactor next to the Winnipeg, and the nuclear power demonstration NPD reactor in Ralston, Ontario, next to the Ottawa River. It's shocking that this has been on the table for about 6 years and is winding its way through a ridiculous exercise of trying to persuade in particularly the local Algonquin nations that they should go along with this. It's, as you say, completely unnecessary. Reactors can be dismantled. I think the barrier is that the failure of both the industry and the government to deal with what is intermediate level waste, which would be reactor components like pressure tubes and such, even approaching high level waste. There is really no plan in Canada for reactor decommissioning waste at present. And it seems like the longer the industry thinks it can drag its feet, the more likely it is that the default will be to simply abandon the reactors where they are and fill them up with concrete, maybe, or maybe even not do that and just abandon them. It's troubling, I think, for people that depend on these major waterways for their drinking water, health, recreation, and so forth. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Joel. Next question is from Simri. Government calls for input about how to deal with nuclear waste. They have her concerned and feels that discussing the disposal, storage of nuclear waste, are we legitimizing the use of nuclear energy, presupposing that nuclear energy is viable and that nuclear waste can actually be managed? Do you think it's realistic to think that it can be? And I think embedded in that is the question about, can you deal with nuclear waste can you ever solve the problem of nuclear waste while we continue to generate it? And in case of fuel waste, to keep the most radioactive waste always at surface, always at the reactor station, because it's just been generated. I'm going to ask, I don't know, Teresa, do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, there's sort of two parts to that question. One is the sort of strategy question about participating in the consultation process, and the other is whether there can ever be a satisfactory answer, or satisfactory to who. In terms of the first question, it's a legitimate question because the consultation processes are highly satisfactory, highly flawed, and very much so by design. And so it's a legitimate question whether to participate. And of course, the Nuclear Waste Watch policy that we've collectively developed says we should stop generating more, and we owe it to the future generations to try and do something about the mess we've already made, we societally. So far, generally CELA would argue that we need good regulatory and oversight processes, but they need to work, they need to be legitimate, they need to be transparent, have the trust of the public, be credible, be based on actual legitimate evidence, and much of that is lacking in the decision making in this sector, including at the Regulatory Commission, never mind the industry consultations. The second question about whether there can ever be, or is there any prospect of doing something about the nuclear waste, is a problem. There is no good answer at the moment, or even on the horizon, or even maybe conceivable, because of the nature of this waste. This is extremely, maybe the most toxic waste human beings have created. And it's going to be, some of it, like the fuel waste, is going to be toxic for millennia and millennia and millennia beyond, the history of human civilization. And we're leaving this, whatever we decide, or de facto, or don't decide and leave it, for, all of future humanity to cope with. And it's for this blink of an eye electricity production purpose, which has many alternatives without anything like that kind of legacy. So on the technical question, what's the least bad of a bunch of terrible options, which is often what we're dealing with in the world of environmental assessment and decision making. This is true in any kind of waste discussion or energy discussion generally, but it's so much more acute here. So maybe my co-panelists have answers to the, how do we answer the what's the least bad question when the least bad is really pretty terribly awful.
And I'll say go to session number 2 recording for that. I'm going to move on to the next question from Mary. Sorry, Ola, did you want to add in? Sorry.
Yeah, well, that was an excellent answer, Teresa. And I just wanted to say, I think all of us struggle with the question of whether to participate in these bogus consultation, performative activities. But as you say, we do cling to this notion there are less bad ways to deal with this. There are ways to deal with it that reduce the burden that's going to be placed on future generations. It's definitely not going to be eliminated, but so I don't know, there's a certain compulsion to keep trying, at least to point out that we at least need to have a discussion, an open, fair discussion about the different options, the different alternatives. And well, for example, in the case of the near surface disposal facility at Chalk River, there was no pre-planning discussion. It was decided by the foreign multinational consortium that they were going to do this cheap thing close to the river, and they simply decided it and announced it, and they've defended it for the last 7 years, and now it's in court. So there's got to be something a little better than that particular route. And my hats are off to the First Nations that have been willing to weigh in on this because they've been around for millennia and have some thoughts about, how to deal with this in the least bad way.
Thank you all. Question from Mary to Susan. What's the motivation behind the reprocessing in the Moltex project? Doesn't eliminate the waste. So what is the motivation?
Right. Well, you're right about that, Mary, about it not eliminating the waste. There's a few answers to that. From the New Brunswick perspective, New Brunswick is the only province outside of Ontario that has an operational nuclear power reactor, and that's a big thing in New Brunswick in terms of how the province sees itself, the fact that it has all of these nuclear engineers and nuclear capacity in our small province. And so there's a real desire to keep the nuclear industry going. And the whole rationale for the Moltex project has been described to the public consistently as an industrial development project. It really, that's the core of it. They want to build a nuclear waste recycling industry here. I don't know how well they think of it now. Our energy minister recently announced he's not going to re-offer in the next election. And he was the biggest champion of this project. So, and it's been going on for 6 years and it hasn't received any industry interest basically, but that was the sort of idea from the New Brunswick side of it. Something similar from the Canadian side, because of course this is all part of a pan-Canadian push for these small reactors. The Moltex project was part of that Canada push. And Canada sees itself as being part of the nuclear club internationally. And, that's a point of pride for Canada, and it wants to continue the industry for a variety of reasons. I would say that reprocessing where it's happened elsewhere is very, very expensive, as well as highly polluting and all the other things about it, but it's very, very expensive. So it doesn't really make sense, but it's always been a desire of the nuclear industry, both internationally and domestically here in Canada, to do reprocessing, because there's the concept that if you can remove plutonium from the used nuclear fuel to make new fuel, then you would have almost a self-perpetuating industry, or at least that's the idea. It hasn't worked out that way anywhere, but this is this sort of nuclear dream that it could continue to perpetrate itself, almost forever is the idea. And so and of course the nuclear industry is in Canada, it's almost exclusively funded by public funds, right? All of the operating nuclear power reactors are owned by the public. It's all, subsidized, if you will, by the public, not if you will, it is. And so this is something that the industry, they don't really have much skin in the game. Moltex, for example, I mentioned that so far all the funds, coming in have come in from the public. And last year they asked for another 250 million, which they didn't get. But who knows what's going to happen? I mean, these are people who want to keep their industry going, and they see it as an opportunity if they can just find someone to keep handing over millions, and hopefully from their perspective billions. They can just keep going and doing their pet projects for the next few years. And so these are the motivations that I see, the main motivations. I hope that answers your question, Mary.
Thanks, Susan. Question from Dennis to all. At the CRNL session, Dennis asked what reports are available that document inventory of radionuclides such as C418 in the bioshield at NPD and Whiteshell. There's a highly uncertain, given that activation is highly uncertain, particularly for C418 that could be generated. Question was deemed too technical to answer, and I would be sent a reply that I've not received. Where is such documentation? Ol, can you help with this?
I'll try. Dennis, you probably know about as much about trying the challenge of measuring these lower energy beta emitters like tritium and carbon-14 is immense. And the databases for the nuclear waste, particularly the federal nuclear waste that's been generated over the past 80 years, are very poor. And we've talked to the experts at this, who are retired AECL scientists, like Harry Burns and J.R. Walker and so forth. And it's part of our legal case against the NSDF that we simply don't know what would go in that facility. So it's true of these the intermediate level waste in these reactors. How much carbon-14 is there? How do you measure it? How expensive would it be to try to measure it accurately? And from the experts, we've learned it's a very difficult and expensive process to try to do this. And another reason for not just leaving it at the surface when you don't know what it is. And we also know that carbon-14 tends to get completely ignored in terms of its mobility in the environment, its toxicity in humans. It's much like tritium that way. There are plumes of carbon-14 moving out of the waste areas at Chalk River and into the wetlands and Perch Lake and so forth. And they pretend, the CNL officials, that carbon-14 doesn't even exist, basically. You can find literature about those waste plumes in the peer-reviewed literature, but it's never mentioned carbon-14 as a pollutant in the environmental reports that are officially released from CNL. It's a big issue, and just another argument for not continuing with nuclear power generation when we don't even know what the pollutants that are being generated really are.
Great, thanks all. A question from Cal, I'll direct to Susan. Cal asks, if young academics are entering doctorate studies for nuclear issues, are they dependent on industry for funding? And Cal is not following the rule about asking only one question, because it goes on to ask, how much risk to the ocean is there when private companies decide to try reprocessing as a new source of income right beside nuclear plants? Are the fisheries and oceans expert against these commercial engineering ideas within the federal service?
Okay, as far as I know, there's only 2, possibly 3 universities in Canada that offer graduate courses and possibly even undergraduate courses in nuclear engineering. There's the University of New Brunswick. I believe McMaster might offer some courses, and then there's the Ontario, what's it called? The Ontario University Institute of Technology, or some combination of that name, have courses in nuclear engineering. The extent to which they are funded by the industry, I know certainly that the one at the University of New Brunswick gets a significant amount of funding from the nuclear industry. I'm not sure about the ones in Ontario, but I suspect so. But keeping in mind just a broader sense, as I said, that when they graduates from these programs go out and go into nuclear industry jobs, pretty well all of those jobs are sustained with public funding or with ratepayer funding in some way or another. Hope that answers the first part of your question. The second part of your question, what sort of, I guess, the morality or the legitimacy of private companies conducting these reprocessing experiments beside, bodies of water such as the Bay of Fundy. That's an interesting question, and I can tell you from the perspective of the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick that when we've mobilized public engagement to participate in various consultations, et cetera, that have happened on nuclear issues, the thing that mobilizes people the most in New Brunswick is the potential impact on the Bay of Fundy. People are very concerned about that, and I think rightly so. But legally, the Point Lepreau nuclear station is owned by our public utility, NB Power, and as far as I understand, and maybe Teresa or Ol can correct me, they have pretty well carte blanche to do what they want there. I mean, if this goes forward, if the Moltex project does go forward, there will be hearings, where the public has an opportunity to have an input. at the CNSC, but what, you know, the chances of the public kind of putting a halt to a project once it moves forward with the support of the government and the industry, I don't know, maybe Teresa has her hand up. Maybe you want to weigh in on that one. Thanks.
I actually put my hand up for the first part of the question, but yeah, on that one, I'll just say that we've seen a real retrenchment on the part of the extent to which some of the other departments in the federal civil service will stand up at the hearings and express their concerns. They used to do so, and over the years, that's really been modified into very supportive talking points by a much more senior official rather than, you know, the people who were doing the actual analysis. Nevertheless, it's quite important to reach out to those departmental officials and get them to look at the matter that's within their purview that they know about and try to elevate those concerns, like fisheries health, for example. But the reason I was putting my hand up is in respect of the first part of the question. We have with us on the call, I think he's still here, is Dr. Ramana. And so I looked up his title. He's the professor and Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Society at School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, UBC. So there's, in terms of career prospects, there are other avenues of study in addition to the straight nuclear engineering study that might provide alternative perspectives and alternative career paths.
Thanks. And thanks, Teresa. And I'll just weigh in that both Ol and Ramana put in a list of member organizations. So the number of universities that offer courses on nuclear are quite broad, and Teresa alluded to that as well, but there's a link in the chat. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Teresa, if you could take the next question from Dennis. Dennis is asking, he's referring to the hearings for the BWRX 300 reactor. So if it's hearings, it must have been the hearings on the decision whether a new environmental assessment is required, which happened about a month ago. Dennis asked about the requirement for a technical review of disposal approaches for new used fuel with new technical issues has not been done before considering licensing of the BWRX 300 as required by the Nuclear Waste Act. The Act requires an independent review and costing of approaches that is not being done. Why is the Act not being followed, and why was his question ignored? I think, and honestly, Dennis, I think this is a question for the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. I was going to refer it to Teresa because I saw it was about EA and BWRX 300, but I don't know, Teresa, if you want to weigh in on that, or if we want to just chalk this up to another difficulty with the flawed Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission hearing process. Teresa, do you want to weigh in at all?
I think all I'll say on that is when I make general statements about the lack of credibility in those public processes, like the CNSC hearings, and the lack of trust, that's because time and again, people who have very important questions to ask or very good depth and serious information to bring forward are sidelined, or the most non-responsive quote answers are provided, and these things are accepted by the decision makers, whether they be the government decision makers or the regulatory decision makers. And that is partly what drives us in valiantly trying to seek a better process that would actually have things like, for example, qualification of experts. You know, the fact that people can stand up in front of the commission from industry or from the regulator without explaining what expertise they have and give bland assurances is something that would never be countenanced in any other type of regulatory decision making in this country. And yet this is one of the most hazardous industries. It's completely turned on its head. And similarly, there's no sworn evidence, there's no cross-examination, there's all kinds of ways that the evidence is not tested. And then when there's a challenge, when there's a real concern that has heft behind it, we don't see that get serious attention. So the question of why, I think, goes back to this problem that it's working very well for the industry right now. And so there's no support on that side to see the system made more transparent and made more rigorous.
Great, thanks, Teresa. I'm going to refer a question from Philip. Approximately what is the size of a small nuclear reactor? I think maybe Philip's referring to small modular reactors compared to the large ones. Susan, can you help with that?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I mentioned the Point Lepreau nuclear plant, which is actually the image behind me. There you go. It's a 650 megawatt electric reactor. The two that are being proposed for New Brunswick, the Moltex one is proposed to be 300 megawatts. So for example, if we wanted to replace, Benby Power wanted to replace the Lepreau reactor with the Moltex reactor, they would have to build two of them. There's another reactor proposed to for New Brunswick is a 100 megawatts. So they would need 6 or 7 of them, just for example. The one being built at Darlington is also a 300 megawatt. In terms of the actual physical size, the reactor proposed for Darlington, I'm just looking, I made a note here, the BWRX 300, if it's built, it will actually be 23 stories high. Some of that will be underground, so not small. The Moltex reactor, I couldn't find in the time I was just looking here the exact size, but the whole compound would be about the size of a football field, something like that, the whole enclosure. And then the buildings would be inside. There are smaller reactors being proposed. There's a 5 megawatt heat, I think, reactor. And maybe you know the answer to this one, Brene, the one that they're proposing for Chalk River. That size keeps changing. I think the last I saw it's 20 megawatt or something like that.
I'll pass that to Ole. Yeah, the micromodular reactor by Global First Power. It increased. I don't remember. I don't think it went to 20.
Yeah, I think it went to 15 per name, but that does seem to be a trend for these small modular reactors. It's simply the efficiencies of scale disappear increasingly as they get smaller and smaller. So then the proponents say, "Oh well, we just decide we make it bigger," and that's what's happened with that one at Chalk River, which is never going to get built because OPG is putting all its eggs into the BWRX 300 at Darlington, and we haven't seen any movement. But I could be wrong. I mean, the nuclear industry loves small reactors. I mean, I say they're very small modular reactors. They're small modular reactors. They're medium and they're large small modular reactors. And then there's the nuclear industry has renewed its enthusiasm for very large reactors now with the SNC-Lavalin Monarch proposal of 1,000 megawatt reactor. So, I mean, they want it all, and they'll just keep throwing everything on the wall and hoping something sticks.
And the ratepayers have apparently deep pockets, so they can attempt to have them all. I'm going to send the next question also to you all. A question from Sam about intermediate level waste. Does this include reactor buildings that will need to be shipped thousands of kilometers?
The general idea, and this is very clear in the Iroquois Anishinaabe alliance, where these two major indigenous groups thought about this topic of what to do with waste, and they said don't ship it as little as possible. Yes, move it away from major water bodies, but don't transport it all around the country. Unfortunately, now that the NWMO has pronounced that there shall be one DGR for intermediate level waste, and we don't have any idea where that will be or how the siting process will go. Yeah, the possibility is certainly there that it could get shipped, and the reactor decommissioning waste could go thousands of kilometers, much like the Ignace Dryden proposal for the high level fuel rods. So the answer is it would be best to minimize the distance if this, and we do want to see the reactors dismantled, not left in place, and we don't want to see them near major water bodies. It needs to be moved away, but as little as possible, basically, and geologic considerations and so forth come into play there. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Joel. Question I'll direct to Teresa from Mary. NWMO claims that there's a consensus among scientific community globally that a deep geological repository is the safest way to deal with high-level nuclear waste. Is there any organized group of scientists who are challenging this assertion, as well as the assertion that nuclear energy itself is a green solution to meet our energy needs?
That's for you, Brene.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think I'm the right person for that one.
Okay, well, I'm supposed to be the moderator, so I wasn't going to step in. So Mary, there are a number of different alliances. They don't have the sort of the budget and the graphic designers that, for example, the industry alliances or the International Atomic Energy Agency has. But there is, in the US, there's a group called the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability. In the UK, there's a group called the Nuclear Consultancy. There's an alliance of group of scientists and technical people in Sweden. So they are not, I don't know that there's a institutional organization, but there certainly are consulting groups, technical groups, and working groups among technical experts internationally. And there is a strong body of criticism of deep geological repositories are being, expressed by those academics. And we have, in Canada and the US, some of those technical experts as well. So there is that alliance or network of technical experts, but I wouldn't say that there's a single international or even North American-wide body. As well as the assertion that there's nuclear energy as a green solution to meet our energy needs. I'm going to pass that one to Susan. I think Susan has been tracking more closely the debunking of the green taxonomy debate. Or Teresa or Susan? Teresa, you looked surprised when I was going to send it to you. Or Susan, you looked surprised.
No, Susan. Oh, okay. Well, Susan can start. She's been researching this, it sounds like.
The
greenwashing analysis.
The green solution. Well, yeah. Okay. So I'll just say that that is being challenged, this green solution idea, and you'll hear more about that in the coming weeks, I suppose. There's actually a formal challenge that some of us here on the call are involved in. But, as I mentioned, the greenwashing of nuclear, and a number of us have written about it. Some of the people in the participant list too are writing about that. It's completely false, but we write about it, but the nuclear industry has deeper pockets, and that's their mantra. You'll probably hear this: there's no path to net zero without nuclear. That's their tagline. And it is completely false, but that's how they're selling themselves, because by doing that, they can insert themselves into all the, the clean and green energy funding that's available for those technical developments. And that's the money that they're after. Teresa, do you want?
Yeah, so the tagline that a number of us developed in response is that, at least vis-a-vis climate change, nuclear is a dangerous, dirty distraction, because for a number of reasons. It's not clean. There's accident risk, there's routine emissions, there's waste that lasts forever. That's highly hazardous. Any of these new technologies can't be developed fast enough to be a serious response to climate change. The scale up would be impossible to meet the climate change issues. We have truly renewable alternatives. And it's a distraction because the people who love their gadgets want to throw their money at this shiny new gadget instead of putting it into real climate solutions and, doing the really hard work to make the change we need around the way we utilize energy and cause pollution.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. So we have 3 more questions, and I think we're going to try and wrap up within about the next 10 minutes. A question from Mary to Susan. Mary Ludwig is asking, none of her friends who regularly consume mainstream media seem to know anything about questions concerning the nuclear industry, its activities, its intentions. So where is investigative reporting? Susan.
Okay. The Globe and Mail actually has the most articles about nuclear energy, but in terms of investigative, really, Matthew McLaren at the Globe and Mail is the main one doing it. And not that he writes a lot about it, but that would be the main one. The National Observer over the last couple of years has been pretty good. They've published a number of articles. They've kind of gotten their act together after not being so good on nuclear for a while. Those are the two kind of mainstream. Post media is absolutely horrible, like the National Post, Ottawa Citizen, any of those are really bad on nuclear issues. If you're really interested in following it, I would say the Energy Mix is not behind a paywall. The Hill Times, I mentioned that earlier, is behind an expensive paywall, so you won't get it there. Rabble, Ole has written articles on nuclear in Rabble, which is not behind a paywall. But in terms of independent media, and I'm going to put this in the NB Media Co-op, which has published a lot of articles on nuclear because this is a big issue in the in the critical community in New Brunswick, and so that's the place where you'll find a lot of critical articles on nuclear. But yeah, I'd have to admit it's a news wasteland out there. Part of the problem, and we've heard this directly from journalists, is it's just so complicated, right? You know, to put together a story on nuclear issues when you don't really have the background and you're trying to do it for a 5 o'clock deadline, it's just not going to happen. So they tend to avoid it.
Thanks, Susan. Question from Laura to Teresa. I believe you mentioned in the radioactive waste policy will be reviewed every 10 years. Do we, the public, have a mechanism to trigger a review for when shifts in industry happen sooner than 10 years? For example, thinking of SMRs and of the interest to put them anywhere when advancements like this happen that create even more complex issues for waste management. How can we provoke urgent policy review change to ensure some level of proactive policy? Teresa.
Well, of course, that's in part a political question. So you can initiate a change in the requirements, a change in the legislation that can speed up, the status quo around timing of reviews, for example. But also the Impact Assessment Act is being rewritten right now to respond to the Supreme Court of Canada's ruling. And among other things, there is the potential to impact the project list under that legislation, which has very unsatisfactorily excluded some major nuclear projects. So it's not just a legal question, that is one route, but one of the ways to prompt changes to the law is to prompt political interest.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. Two more questions. Next one from Lorraine, I'm going to pass to Ole. Has there been any research that would give us a total for all water consumed by the nuclear industry on an annual basis?
Great question, and that I would have to look into. This is what happens when you're a scientist. When you don't really know the answer, but it's a good question, then you want to go off and find out. So thanks.
Yeah, it is. I do have something to add on this, believe it or not, which is that Ontario introduced pricing for consumptive water takings out of basin. And in doing that, analyze the evaporative losses from nuclear power. So back in the kind of mid-2000s timeframe, there would be a white paper that has some data, at least for that kind of loss. Yeah, because that was the biggest kind of loss from that sector was from the evaporative loss from cooling.
Great, thanks, Teresa. So a last question is from Dennis. If the Nuclear Waste Act, I think, Dennis, you're meaning the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, is in fact not being followed for new reactors with new waste, can and should Northwatch or other groups pursue a legal challenge for these new reactors? It might be the only way to stop this madness. Since you named Northwatch, I'm going to start off and invite others to come in. I think one of the difficulties, Dennis, is the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act is maddeningly and purposefully vague. So it actually does open the door for reactor waste from not yet designed reactors. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization, all of their concept development has been based on the CANDO, but the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, unlike most pieces of legislation, it doesn't have a review period. It's 20 years old. It's never been reviewed. It was passed in 2002, so 22 years old, never been reviewed. And that's an issue. But in terms of a legal challenge based on not meeting the provisions of the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, I think that's an interesting question. It's a tricky question because, of course, the cost awards can be enormous against those who bring legal challenges. The Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization has from the beginning years not met the requirements of the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act. For example, in their 2002 to 2005 study period, they didn't meet the requirements of the Act in that period, and that they didn't identify and examine consequences of their proposal based on economic regions. So they've already not met the Act. I'm not confident that there's a case to be made, but I'm not a lawyer.
No, well, I would just say another avenue with which OIL has utilized to great effect is to use the petitions process to the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development under the Federal Auditor General. And so asking for a program review, asking for compliance with the legislation, asking for the adequacy of the oversight under that legislation, those would all be quite legitimate subjects for that kind of a petition.
Quite great. And a final question from Ruth. If Great Lakes experience less ice coverage and lake levels decline, will this stop nuclear expansion? For example, Bruce. Who am I going to give that one to? I'm going to give that one to Teresa.
So would they say they're just going to stick the pipe out further to deal with the water intake and the cooling? These issues of external hazard and the extent to which they've been considered, both in terms of regular operations as well as the risk for accidents, are very badly done. And so raising those kinds of issues, and in fact, the climate change impacts on nuclear power is something that SELA, along with our co-interveners, Durham Nuclear Awareness and Slovenia Helm Association, have been weighing in on some of the recent Pickering and Darlington hearings, together with a colleague of Dr. Romanas, Dr. Chisti. So it's a very legitimate question to raise. Will it stop it? I don't know, but it's very, very, very important to say that a lot of the assumptions that are behind both the costing and the safety analysis may not hold up in the face of some of these climate risks. And water levels are one of them. Water temperatures are another. You know, the big waves that can happen in a terrible storm, flooding, the risk of power outages that are widespread and the replacement power won't last, wind risk, tornadoes, ice, you know, it's on and on and on it goes. Great.
Thank you very much, Teresa. And thanks to all our panelists, to Teresa, Ol, and Susan. And thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks for joining us for the fourth in Northwatch's 4-part series of webinars. I will say the unedited recordings for the first 3 sessions are available now at nonuclearwaste.ca, and the 4th session will be added. I'll be doing a follow-up email with links to the recording and a survey about the webinar series within the next couple of weeks. And in due time, the recordings will be posted to No Nuclear Waste YouTube channel for everybody's convenience. So a couple of websites you can go to for additional information. If you go to nuclearwaste.ca, it's a switchboard, very simple website. It's a switchboard. It links to all of the organizations of our panelists this evening: Concerned Citizens of Renfrew County, Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick, and Canadian Environmental Law Association. And there's also the Nuclear Waste Watch website, where we will post updates, future updates around nuclear waste issues more generally, and certainly future policy developments. So thank you all, panelists, participants, and good night.
Thanks, everyone. Great questions.
Thank you.